Welcome to Cannes Crime. Embark with us on a journey into the brutal case of Dennis Nilsen. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland. Our story begins in the small fishing town of Fraserburgh, nestled in the far northeastern corner of Scotland. Here, in the midst of World War II, Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born to a Scottish mother and a Norwegian father. His father, Olav Nilsen, was a soldier and a fisherman, a man constantly away at sea, leaving young Dennis and his siblings under the care of their mother, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a deeply religious woman, a trait she instilled in her children from a young age. She was a strict disciplinarian, yet she was also known to be loving and protective. Dennis, the middle child of three, was particularly close to his mother. But with the absence of his father, who he barely knew, he grew up longing for a male figure to look up to. Early signs of Nilsen's deviant behavior were noticeable in his childhood. He was fascinated by death, often visiting a local cemetery, not out of morbid curiosity, but with a sense of comfort and familiarity. He was intrigued by the concept of life after death, a topic he often discussed with his mother. When Nilsen was just 6 years old, his beloved grandfather passed away. The event was a traumatic one for him, as he was made to view his grandfather's body, an experience that left a deep and disturbing impression on this exposure to death at such a young age would later become a significant factor in his life. Tragedy struck again when Nilsen was in his early teens. His father, who he barely knew, died at sea. This loss, coupled with the death of his older brother a few years later, left him feeling isolated and emotionally detached. During his adolescent years, Nilsen began grappling with his sexuality. Living in a conservative society, he found it difficult to accept his attraction towards men. He tried to suppress his feelings, leading to internal conflict and further deepening his sense of isolation. Despite these struggles, Nilsen was a bright student and a talented musician. He joined the Army Cadet Force at school and later enlisted in the British Army, seeking the structure and discipline he lacked at home. His time in the army was an escape from his personal turmoil, but it also exposed him to more death and violence, further feeding his fascination. In his early 20s, Nilsen moved to London, hoping for a fresh start. However, his past continued to haunt him. His struggle with his sexuality intensified, leading him to engage in risky behavior and petty crimes. His fascination with death, which had lain dormant during his time in the army, was rekindled, and he began to fantasize about having complete control over another person, even in death. These early life experiences shaped Nilsen into the man he would eventually become. The isolation, the fascination with death, and the struggle with his sexuality all played a part in creating one of the most notorious serial killers Scotland has ever seen. But it was his move to London that would ultimately set the stage for the horrific crimes he would commit. As Nilsen entered his young adult life, his deviant behavior started to manifest. The seeds of depravity, sown in the fertile soil of his troubled childhood, began to sprout in his adolescent years, giving rise to early signs of the monster he was to become. Nilsen's journey into adulthood was marked by a tumultuous struggle with his own sexuality. As he grappled with his gay identity, the societal pressures of the time forced him to keep his sexual orientation hidden. This internal battle was the first step on the path that would ultimately lead to his sinister and deadly obsession with control and power. During his early adult years, Nilsen took up employment in two institutions that are often associated with discipline and authority: the army and the police force. While these roles are designed to instill a sense of duty and respect for human life, for Nilsen, they seem to have the opposite effect. The power and control inherent in these roles may have fueled his own desire for dominance, paving the way for the horrific acts he would later commit. While serving in the army, Nilsen began to experiment with his darker desires. He would often get drunk and lure young men to his quarters, where he would watch them sleep. These were not yet violent acts, but they were clear indications of his escalating deviant behavior. After leaving the army, Nilsen joined the Metropolitan Police. Here, his deviant behavior took a more sinister turn. He began to target men, particularly those who were vulnerable or marginalized. He would lure these men to his home under the pretense of companionship or help, only to exploit their vulnerability to satisfy his own dark desires. Despite these early signs, Nilsen's crimes remained under the radar. His victims were often the forgotten ones of society, and their disappearances went unnoticed. This lack of attention allowed Nilsen's crimes to escalate, pushing him further down the path of depravity. In this period of his life, Nilsen's crimes were not yet murderous, but they were indicative of his growing fascination with power, control, and manipulation. He was learning how to lure his victims, how to gain their trust, and how to exploit their vulnerabilities. These skills would later become the tools of his deadly trade. His struggle with his sexuality, his employment in the army and the police, and his early crimes all played a part in shaping the man Nilsen would become. They laid the foundation for the horror that would follow, a horror that would shock the world and forever etch his name into the annals of criminal history. Nilsen's early crimes were only a prelude to the horror that was to come. Between 1978 and 1983, Nilsen murdered at least 12 young men. This is the chilling reality of Dennis Nilsen's reign of terror. Each victim was unique, each story heartbreakingly tragic. Let's delve into these stories, into the lives that were tragically ended, and the ways in which Nilsen committed these heinous acts. The first victim was Stephen Holmes. Just 14 years old, he crossed paths with Nilsen on a cold December night in 1978. Nilsen lured him back to his flat, promising warmth and shelter. When Stephen attempted to leave the next day, Nilsen strangled him with a necktie and drowned him in a bucket of water. For over 7 months, Nilsen lived with Stephen's body, hiding it under his floorboards. In late 1979, Nilsen met his second victim, Canadian student Kenneth Ockenden. He was a tourist, relishing the sights of London. Kenneth's last sight, however, was the interior of Nilsen's apartment. The method was the same, strangulation, but this time with the cord of a headphone. His body was also kept for several months before being disposed of under the floorboards. Just a few months later, Martin Duffy, a 16-year-old runaway from Birkenhead, would become the third victim. Nilsen used the same method of strangulation and drowning. Martin's body was kept in a wardrobe for 2 weeks before being moved under the floorboards. Nilsen's depravity continued to escalate. His next victims, Billy Sutherland, Malcolm Barlow and John Howlett, were also subjected to the same horrifying fate. Each was strangled, their bodies kept for varying lengths of time. Nilsen would sometimes engage in conversations with the bodies, a twisted form of companionship. He later admitted that these acts gave him a sense of control, a feeling he found intoxicating. The killing didn't stop there. Nilsen moved to a new flat in 1981, but the change of scenery did nothing to curb his murderous impulses. His victims in this new location included Graham Allen, Steve Sinclair, and 3 unidentified men. Graham Allen was a 27-year-old father of 1. He met Nilsen in a pub and was coerced back to his flat, where he was strangled and dismembered. His remains were disposed of in a bonfire in Nilsen's backyard. Steve Sinclair was a drug addict. Nilsen lured him back to his flat with the promise of more drugs. Once there, he was strangled with a ligature and dismembered. His remains were found in a tea chest in Nilsen's living room. The 3 unidentified men met similar fates. Strangled, dismembered, and disposed of, their identities remain unknown, a testament to the vastness and anonymity of Nilsen's crimes. Throughout all of this, Nilsen remained eerily calm. He later described the murders as being in a dreamlike state. He claimed that he felt compelled to kill, that it was an urge he couldn't resist. The act of killing, he said, gave him a sense of power, a feeling of being godlike. But what of the aftermath? How did Nilsen react to the horrific acts he had committed? Nilsen's actions post-murder are perhaps the most chilling aspect of his crimes. He would keep the bodies for extended periods, engaging in conversations with them, even bathing and dressing them. He lived with the bodies, treating them as companions. It was a twisted, macabre form of companionship, a testament to his deeply disturbed psyche. Throughout his killing spree, Nilsen showed no signs of remorse or guilt. Instead, he seemed to derive pleasure from his actions, reveling in the control and power he held over his victims. He viewed the act of murder as a form of possession, a way to keep his victims with him forever. His victims were not just bodies to him, they were his companions, his confidants. He would talk to them, share his thoughts and feelings with them. In his warped mind, he had created a macabre family, a grotesque parody of human relationships. He was a puppet master, controlling his victims, even in death. As we delve into these horrifying details, it's important to remember that these were real people, with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. They were sons, brothers, friends. Their lives were cruelly cut short by a man whose depravity knew no bounds. Their stories serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. Each victim's life was cut short by Nilsen's unimaginable brutality. These were not nameless, faceless victims. They were individuals, each with their own story, their own life. And each one of them deserves to be remembered, not as a victim, but as a person. A person whose life was tragically and cruelly cut short. Nilsen's gruesome killing spree finally came to an end when a drain outside his home became clogged with human remains. It was an ordinary day in February 1983 when Dino Rod, a plumbing company, was called to Cranley Gardens, North London. The tenants had been complaining about a foul smell emanating from the drains. But what started as a routine call quickly turned into a scene straight out of a horror movie. The plumbers made a grisly discovery, a drain blocked with a mass of flesh-like substance and small bones. Alarmed, they alerted the police, setting in motion a series of events that would shock the nation. The ensuing investigation led the police to flat number 23, occupied by a seemingly ordinary man, Dennis Nilsen. A civil servant by day, Nilsen was living a double life, one that was about to unravel. As the police stepped into his flat, a chilling odor hit them. It was a smell they could never forget, the smell of death. The search of Nilsen's home proved to be a horrifying experience. Investigators found human remains, including bones and body parts, hidden in various parts of the flat. They also discovered a collection of personal items belonging to the victims, a chilling testament to the lives brutally ended by Nilsen. As the evidence mounted, Nilsen was brought in for questioning. He was calm, composed, and eerily cooperative. When asked about the human remains, he casually admitted to the murders, as if discussing the weather. He confessed to killing 15 young men over a span of 5 years. The police were stunned. They were dealing with a serial killer, one who had been living undetected in their midst. Nilsen's confession was chillingly detailed. He spoke about his victims, how he lured them to his home, strangled them, and then lived with their bodies for extended periods. He talked about his ritual of bathing, dressing, and even sleeping next to the corpses. The level of depravity was beyond comprehension. As the news broke, the nation was gripped with fear and disbelief. How could such a monstrous killer have lived among them, unnoticed for so long? Nilsen's neighbors were in shock. They remembered him as a quiet, solitary figure, one who kept to himself. Little did they know about the dark secrets he was harboring. The discovery of Nilsen's crimes sent shockwaves through the country. It raised alarming questions about how a serial killer could operate undetected in a bustling city like London. It forced the society to confront the vulnerability of the marginalized, the ones Nilsen preyed on. In the end, it was a clogged drain that brought Nilsen's dark world into the light. An ordinary plumbing issue led to an extraordinary discovery, unmasking one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. The discovery of human remains in the drain led investigators directly to Nilsen, ending his reign of terror. Nilsen was brought to trial in October 1983, charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. In a courtroom filled with the echo of unspeakable atrocities, the evidence against Nilsen was staggering. The prosecution presented a macabre tableau of evidence, each piece more chilling than the last. From the haunting photographs of the crime scenes to the grisly details of post-mortem examinations, the courtroom bore witness to the dark depths of Nilsen's depravity. Among the most damning pieces of evidence were the human remains discovered in the drain outside Nilsen's home, a grisly discovery that eventually led to his arrest. Forensic experts testified that the remains bore the unmistakable signs of being subjected to Nilsen's brutal rituals. Yet, it wasn't just the physical evidence that painted a grim picture of Nilsen's crimes. The testimonies of the survivors provided a terrifying glimpse into the mind of the killer. Their accounts of Nilsen's actions were chilling, their words painting vivid and horrifying images that echoed through the courtroom. One survivor, a young man who had narrowly escaped Nilsen's clutches, described his ordeal with a trembling voice. His testimony, fraught with emotion, left a palpable impact on everyone present. The survivors were the living proof of Nilsen's monstrous actions, their words a testament to the horrors they had endured. As the trial progressed, Nilsen's defense was just as shocking as the crimes he was accused of. He admitted to the murders, but argued that the victims had consented to their fate. He claimed that he had killed out of a twisted sense of mercy to alleviate their suffering. This audacious defense, however, found no sympathy among the jury or the judge. When the time came for the jury to deliberate, they returned with their verdict after just 5 hours. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent, the atmosphere heavy with the gravity of the decision. Nilsen, the man who had committed such heinous acts, was finally brought to justice. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, described Nilsen's crimes as a dreadful catalogue of crime that was beyond belief. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. However, the Home Secretary later imposed a whole life tariff, ensuring that Nilsen would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The sentencing marked the end of a dark chapter, but the echoes of Nilsen's crimes continue to reverberate. His trial was one of the most notorious in British criminal history, a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity. Yet, it also served as a testament to the resilience of the survivors, the dedication of the investigators, and the power of justice. Despite his attempts to defend himself, Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison. The harsh reality of his sentence was a grim reminder of the atrocities he had committed, a fitting end to a tale of unimaginable horror. The man who had once held the power of life and death in his hands was now condemned to a life behind bars, his freedom forever taken from him. Nilsen spent the rest of his life in prison, where he died in 2018. Incarcerated for the rest of his years, Dennis Nilsen found himself confined within the cold, unyielding walls of a prison cell. Solitude became his constant companion, a stark contrast to the life he once led on the outside. The man known for his heinous crimes against humanity was now but a number, the face of a monster obscured by the anonymity of prison life. During his time in prison, Nilsen's interactions with other inmates and prison staff were, unsurprisingly, strained. Many recoiled at the thought of sharing a space with a man who had committed such unspeakable acts. But within these interactions, Nilsen remained a paradox. Despite the gruesome nature of his deeds, some found him to be a quiet, even polite man. Yet the chilling knowledge of his past forever colored these interactions, creating a palpable tension that hung heavily in the air. As the years rolled on, Nilsen's life in prison became a grim testament to the consequences of his actions. The freedom he once had was but a distant memory, replaced by the stark reality of confinement. His world, once occupied by the innocent lives he took, was now reduced to the boundaries of his prison cell. But what of his legacy? How did the actions of this one man impact the wider community? The reverberations of Nilsen's crimes were far-reaching. The victims' families were left to grapple with the loss of their loved ones, their lives forever marred by the actions of this man. Grief-stricken and seeking justice, they watched as Nilsen was put behind bars, a small consolation for the immense loss they had suffered. Yet the impact extended beyond the immediate circles of the victims. The wider community grappled with the horror of his actions, left to question how such atrocities could occur in their midst. Shockwaves of fear, disbelief, and grief rippled through society, forever altering perceptions of safety and trust. Even in death, Dennis Nilsen continues to cast a long and unsettling shadow. His life and crimes have been dissected in countless documentaries, books, and articles, each seeking to understand the man behind the monster. His story serves as a chilling case study for criminologists and psychologists alike, a dark exploration into the mind of a serial killer. Dennis Nilsen's life serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary individuals. His legacy is not one of fame or acclaim, but a stark warning. It's a reminder to remain vigilant, to look beneath the surface, and to remember the lives lost to his heinous acts. His story is a testament to the depths humanity can sink when consumed by depravity, a grim narrative that continues to haunt long after his death.